My name is Karen Larson, and I work at the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition, better known as CARLA, at the University of Minnesota. This webinar is part of a series of presentations that CARLA offers each academic year. We have one final webinar this fall from our Social Justice in Language Education initiative, and that will feature language teachers who have implemented social justice curricular units in their classrooms. To get the Zoom link for that presentation, you can go to the URL that you see at the bottom of the slide, and I think Liz is going to put that in the chat. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a couple of things. First of all, we have enabled the chat for back channeling, so you can communicate with each other and with the hosts. Also, if you want to ask Cory a question, please put it in the Q&A. So Cory will answer questions at the end of the presentation, but that is the best way for us to manage Q&A. You can also upvote questions by using the thumbs up icon. The presentation is being recorded, and we will post it on CARLA's presentation recording webpage in a couple of weeks. And Liz will put that link also in the chat for you. The webinar we're doing today is part of CARLA's initiative on secondary dual language immersion, materials development, and research. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Cory Mathieu. Cory is an assistant professor in the professional program in education at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Cory is the leader of the Secondary Immersion Initiative for CARLA, and she's the co-leader of a CARLA Summer Institute on Secondary DLI Continuation Programs. The title of Cory's webinar is Designing Teaching Materials to Integrate Content and Language in Secondary Dual Language and Immersion. Without further ado, I will turn the webinar over to Cory.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you to all of you for being here. As Karen said, it's so wonderful to see people from all over the United States and then around the world as well. As Karen mentioned, we're going to be talking to this evening or this afternoon here in Wisconsin about designing teaching materials for integrating content and language in our secondary dual language immersion bilingual continuation programs. I want to start also by warning you that I have come down with a cold here in winter in Wisconsin. So I will do my best to get through this, and I apologize if I get interrupted with some coughing. We'll make it through. I do want to start with a land acknowledgement here. I'm at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, which is in northeastern Wisconsin. And our land was originally inhabited by First Nations people here in the region. The Ho-Chunk Nation and the Menominee Nation are the original First Nations people of Wisconsin. And both nations have ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land where the institution where I am now resides upon. And today, Wisconsin is home to 12 First Nations communities, including the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Forest County Potawatomi, Ojibwa Nation communities, Stockbridge Munsee Community Band of Mohegan Indians, and the Brothertown Indian Nation. And I like to add this last piece when I'm thinking about land acknowledgements here in the United States and similar up in Canada, that by acknowledging the living story of the land upon or from which I am now speaking, we also remind ourselves of the legacy of colonialism in language education and our responsibility to decolonize our work as immersion, dual language, and bilingual educators. So this is something I take very seriously in my work, and I'm continuing to learn about how I can decolonize my own language education experiences. And you'll see little threads of this throughout my presentation tonight. To give just a brief bit of background, I am currently an assistant professor here at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. I lead our ESL and bilingual education programs. I spent about 6 years in the Twin Cities working with dual language and immersion programs there. And I myself was a former high school Spanish teacher who taught a content-based curriculum. And so that's how I come to these ideas of thinking about how we integrate content and language in our work. My goals for this evening are that you will develop a basic understanding of content language integration, because we got to know what we're trying to integrate, trying to do in our materials before we talk about them. We will think briefly about how instructional materials actually impact teaching and learning, and then you will be introduced to strategies for designing materials to support language instruction within content-focused classrooms. As I was writing these objectives, even I realized how passive they are. So I will do my best to keep this webinar engaging, and I look forward to answering questions at the end of the webinar as well. So content and language integration is a term that is used quite often in dual language and immersion literature, but there's actually some disagreement about what it means. And we have participants here from Europe and other countries where content language integration has kind of taken on a different meaning than in literature here in the United States. And we use different metaphors to describe this practice in our work, but it's central to all content-based language instruction. A common metaphor is the counterbalance, this idea that content and language can be weighed with each other, that sometimes one is more predominant and sometimes the other. But this metaphor has been critiqued for separating out the concepts of content and language as these two distinct things that could be in balance. Instead, another way of thinking about content language integration is as a weaving, where content and language are interwoven across a unit or a lesson. And then lastly, on a more conceptual level, we can think of integrating content and language as understanding how all content or academic subject matter is construed by language. So content and language are really two sides of the same coin. And an example of this would be that in order to integrate content and language meaningfully, teachers need to know the language structures that are used to make arguments, to hypothesize, or to describe in their content areas. And I'll talk about this more in just a little bit. So we don't really have a unified idea of what content language integration is, and yet you'll see through the way that I design materials for secondary dual language and immersion or bilingual classrooms, some of these different metaphors playing out in how I look at this material design. We can also think of content language integration as a mindset. So it's something that teachers, content-based language teachers, need to have and hold in their minds, as well as reactive and proactive instructional strategies that you do in your classroom. And again, the way that I talk about design materials is to support both that mindset that teachers need to hold, as well as the strategies that they're using in their classrooms every day. So this mindset for content language integration, I think of as a term called language alertness. And Carrie McGuire actually coined this term in her dissertation back in 2018. And she wrote that language alertness is a habit of mind in which a content-based language teacher constantly shifts between thinking about content and thinking about language. And so that habit of mind is really important and something that we'll also be returning to in a little bit. But that a content-based language teacher is able to hold in their mind content and language at the same time. And Carrie also says that that language teachers need to be constantly alert to language, looking for language to teach or language that's causing misconceptions, as well as the opportunities to teach that language and clarify those misconceptions. And so when I do this work in workshops where I can interact with teachers, I always ask this question of you. What might it look like or sound like or feel like for you as a teacher if you were embodying this type of language alertness while you are teaching content? So I'm thinking about my secondary teachers who maybe are trained as a social studies teacher, trained as a science teacher. Take a moment and think about, what would it look like in your classroom? What would it sound like? What would I hear? And what would it feel like for you if you had to be language alert as you are teaching your social studies or your science or your language arts? And my teachers' responses when I talk about this are often a lot of excitement. We'd hear a lot of language. We'd hear students talking. We'd hear metalinguistic knowledge, and also some feelings of being really overwhelmed. This is really hard work to hold both content knowledge and facts and concepts and processes at the same time that we're holding language in our minds. And so I want to honor the challenge that this is. And my hope is that the materials that we can design help us overcome some of these challenges or remove some of this burden. So content and language integration is important for many different reasons. I'm only going to talk about two here that are sort of related. And one is that language functions, the things we do with language, are accomplished differently in different academic subjects. I've got a little typo there. Accomplished differently in different academic subjects. So if you're here in the United States, WIDA is an organization that publishes and produces English language development standards, as well as the 2023 citation there is they just published their revised Spanish language development standards. And WIDA pushes us to think about how might we use language to inform, narrate, explain, or argue in science? And how is that different in social studies? How is that different in math? And so content and language integration forces us to think about our own disciplines that we are experts in and think about what is the language of this discipline? How are different language functions done differently in this discipline? It's also important because in order for our students to comprehend and produce disciplinary specific oral and written texts, they need to know the language features of that discipline. And I think of this especially in terms of reading comprehension, when our students are reading in a language that may or may not be their dominant language, that if they don't know the language features of that discipline, they might understand some of the basic facts, but they're going to struggle to deeply understand the genre and the author's meaning and purpose within that discipline itself. Similarly, we can help our students produce language in discipline-specific ways by integrating content instruction and language instruction within our teaching, within our units, and within our lessons. Now, having said this, I want to take one moment to pause and return to that decolonizing language education idea. And I do this with a warning, with a caveat, that this work I'm talking about, this content language integration, and everything I show from here on out should not be used as a tool for linguistic oppression. And that might seem obvious to say, but we need to be very careful when we're thinking about talking about disciplinary language, that we're not being overly prescriptive, and that we are honoring, inviting, and validating also the language practices that students bring to our classrooms. And Ofelia Garcia and Nelson Flores' work has pushed me quite a bit in my thinking on this. I actually include here just a citation of a recent article about academic language and the minoritization of U.S. bilingual Latinx students. I'm sitting on this slide for a moment, so I encourage you to scribble that down if you're not familiar with it, because it's a paper that's really pushed me in my own thinking about disciplinary language and what this means, what I'm talking about here as we get to materials. They remind us there are many ways to use languages to be a scientist, a mathematician, or an author. And so when we're thinking about teaching language in our content-specific classrooms, we need to be very careful about how we're saying what should be done or how we're prescribing certain target language features upon our students. So instead, I shift my thinking a little bit to think about this as two sort of intertwined goals. One being that for students to truly understand content, science, math, social studies, they do need to understand how authors use language to convey that content. However, we're also teaching students that language is a tool that can be wielded to express certain realities for a desired purpose to a specific audience. And so we're being very intentional and thoughtful about when we're telling students they have to use certain language features versus when we're giving them options and helping them expand their linguistic repertoire to make choices as they so choose. So this is a little caveat here of some thinking that I'm continuing to process as I talk about disciplinary language going forward. So what does content language integration look like in action? It looks like explicitly drawing students' attention to the language of a given text, of a given discipline or content area, or a given genre. And we do this in many different ways, but somewhat simply just asking our students, why does the author use a certain language feature? Or, and here's that same repeated question I had earlier, excuse me, asking our students, what are some ways that we might use language to inform, explain, or argue, or narrate in this discipline? How might our language change depending on our purpose or our audience. So content language integration is drawing attention to language. It is also structuring opportunities for students to produce and then receive corrective feedback on specific language for a given topic, a given audience, and a given communicative purpose. So helping students understand how they can use specific language features within a context itself. Now, all of this background, I hope as we move forward, that you'll hold this in your mind as we look at the materials, because you'll hopefully start to see the connections of how I'm embedding these ideas into materials for secondary dual language or bilingual contexts. So another way of thinking about content language integration is the strategies that we use as teachers, is how we frame our work. And so Pauline Gibbons and Dee Teddick and Roy Lister give us some really helpful frameworks for this. Gibbons uses this hourglass metaphor where we begin our work with meaning and knowledge construction, begin our work with content, if you will, having students gain some knowledge about a certain topic or unit, a certain theme, and then really homing in on language, homing in on some type of form that is necessary or that relates to this topic and the content area. And when we're focusing on language, we're doing proactive instructional strategies. We're helping students notice language. We're having them practice those language forms. And then we're also doing reactive instructional strategies throughout this entire process, where we're using questioning techniques to help students produce extended language. We're giving them language-focused corrective feedback on that specific form that we're targeting. And then we zoom back out and have students use this language that they've been working on for knowledge construction. So taking this language that we've taught and moving it back into a more content-focused space where they're now creating some type of product or applying something at the end of a unit using those language features that we just taught. So again, there's a metaphor of content language in balance, a metaphor of content and language interwoven. And here we sort of see an hourglass where content creates some context through which we decide to focus on language. Now, all of this is a pretty quick and dirty overview of content and language integration, but it sets the scene then for what we're trying to accomplish in materials that are specifically designed for dual language and immersion. So there's a lot of challenges to this work. This work is very hard. The first is that, at least in the United States, and I don't know what this is like as much in other countries, but dual language and immersion or bilingual teachers are often trained and licensed as content teachers. Now, this depends on your state. Here in Wisconsin, teachers are trained as bilingual teachers, but in other states, that's not the case. Especially at our secondary level, our teachers tend to focus in on the expertise of their content area. And so this integration, this moving towards also thinking about language requires an identity transformation, as well as more knowledge. You need to have knowledge about language itself, not just your ability to use the language, but your ability to teach the language, your ability to talk about it from a metalinguistic perspective. It also requires very complex pedagogical content knowledge, because it's not just how do I teach content or how do I teach language, it's how do I teach both, maybe at the same time. And lastly, and if you teach in the United States and probably around the world, you know this is true, there are very few appropriate curricular resources and materials that are designed for secondary dual language and immersion or bilingual contexts. And by appropriate, I mean two different things. And I want to be very clear about this. I mean that there are not many materials where the language level aligns with students' language proficiencies that also have the content we hope to teach. So I've worked with secondary teachers. I mostly work with Spanish teachers, although I'm happy to work with any language teachers. I've had secondary, history teachers find a textbook from Chile. It's a beautiful textbook, and we're actually gonna look at an example of it tonight, with content that they want to teach. It actually hits the standards, but the language proficiency is way too high for most of their students in their dual language program. Or I have teachers who are using a translated textbook where maybe the textbook, the translation isn't great, or the language proficiency is too low for some of their students. They're ready for more complex language. So that's one way that it's hard to find appropriate curricular materials. The other thing that I mean by this is that these materials, even if they're a translated text, even if it's a text in the target or partner language, are not designed specifically for dual language and immersion. They're not designed to help a teacher or help the students integrate content and language together. As far as I know, there are no materials out there that have been truly designed with content and language integration in mind that's used in the United States. I would love for you to correct me if I'm wrong. So we're going to focus in now on this idea of curriculum, resources, and materials. And you might even be wondering, what is she talking about? Designed for dual language and immersion? That's where we're going for the rest of our time here together. But we're going to start by thinking really briefly about curriculum and this material, how materials and teachers work together. So when I think about secondary dual language and immersion or bilingual programs, and I think about the curriculum of these programs, there's actually several different ways to approach this. We can think of the curriculum of, a social studies program across 6th through 9th grade as being the content area state standards. Here in the United States, that's how a lot of our programs are based on our state standards. And so there's the content that we're given is the content area state standards that we have to teach. The curriculum can also be thought of as the textbook or the purchased curriculum that you have, that you need to teach, that you're told that this is the program you have to follow. And I put here, if you are lucky, because so many of the teachers that I have worked with have said, I don't have a textbook at all. I wish I had a textbook, not because I want to follow it like a scripted curriculum, but because I'm making everything myself. And some of you might be nodding along with this. But the curriculum of secondary dual language and immersion also needs to be language. It needs to be a scope and sequence for general language proficiency in the partner language and in English if you're in a dual language program, or in the partner language if you're in an immersion program, as well as disciplinary specific language instruction. So the curriculum sort of has two different strands that need to be working in tandem. And I personally have not seen very many programs that have been able to manage these two strands because there are no published materials out there that think of it this way. I also want to briefly introduce you to some ways that we can theoretically think about what these textbooks and materials do for our teachers, or to our teachers, depending on how we want to think about it. So there's some folks who've done fascinating work in math and science education, and they talk about the relationship between teachers and curriculum and the relationship between teachers and materials. And one way that they think about this is that we have an official curriculum, the state standards or the textbook that you have, and then the operational curriculum, or what actually happens in your classroom, which is the planned or enacted lessons where you as the teacher are looking at that textbook or that curriculum and saying, well, here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I'm going to sequence this. I know my students best. And a key thing about this model, if you will, is that it implies that the teacher changes the curriculum. And it's kind of a one-way street, or the teacher changes the materials. But what we know from other research, and the research that I've done in dual language and immersion programs, shows that it's actually more of a participatory relationship. And so the teacher brings wonderful assets to this relationship. The teacher brings their pedagogical content knowledge, their beliefs, their goals, their experiences. But the material that you're working with, your instructional materials, the handouts you're giving to students, your textbooks, your PowerPoints, are actually impacting how you teach. They present the concepts oftentimes. They give the tasks to the students. They have certain structures that impact what you end up doing in your classroom, whatever your goals might have been for that lesson. They also have a voice. And what's very fascinating about this is that we have some research that shows that the materials actually sort of turn into another entity in the classroom. So here's an example for you. This is a basic fill in the blank material that I found, just online. So there's a map here, and there's directions on the bottom of things that the student needs to do. Color in green, the coastal mountains, color in red, yada, yada, yada. And we can think of this handout, this material, as having very low teacher responsibility. The teacher doesn't have to do much. You could give this to the student and they could follow all the directions. It's all there. In my research, what I've found when teachers use materials like this, they actually start to make some really interesting comments when they're talking to students. They say things like, they tell you to do blank, or it asks you to do. And so the teacher is actually giving this worksheet some agency. Some person who's not here in this classroom is telling you what to do. I, the teacher, I'm not telling you what to do. The worksheet's telling you what to do, right? And some of you might be wondering, like, what the heck does this have to do with dual language and immersion? It will all come back around, I promise. But the key here is to think about how the worksheets, the PowerPoints, the textbooks that you're using in your classroom actually become another entity in that space. I know when I'm teaching, I use PowerPoints now in the college level classroom quite a lot. I don't use any textbooks. But when I'm teaching, I'm going along and the PowerPoint might tell me to do something I wasn't planning on doing. And then all of a sudden there's a moment of dissonance where I'm thinking, ooh, do I follow the PowerPoint or do I follow my plan? Right? Or like my new idea. I usually go for my new idea, but the PowerPoint becomes an entity in the classroom that's telling me what to do, even though it's this thing that I created. So what does this all have to do with dual language and immersion? Well, what we know about this teacher material relationship is that our materials, our worksheets, our PowerPoints, our textbooks prompt teachers to use them in certain ways. How the material is designed is going to help or hinder you from doing something specific in the classroom. The ways activities are organized on the material will help or hinder you. And the questions that are asked of students on the material often become the questions then that become central to the discourse of the classroom. And so what this has to do with dual language and immersion or bilingual education is that if the materials only prompt a focus on content, you as a DLI teacher have to do a lot of extra cognitive and instructional work to integrate language. You have to be language alert all on your own with no support from the resources that you're using to teach. And so the real question I ask in my work and that we're going to turn to now is what happens when these materials actually prompt a focus on language as well? So we're going to get into some real examples now. So this is an example of a very typical middle school textbook. I'm using English here for some of my examples because I know I've got people from all over the world now, speak many different languages. This is an example of a typical middle school textbook in the United States. It's talking about Athens. There's some information there. We've got one word bolded in yellow, and we've got an image, yada, yada, yada. Later on in this chapter, there's a little bit more content. And then there's a lesson review at the bottom that has some activities for students to do. If the teacher teaches this textbook, whether they're having students read independently in groups, they're reading as a whole class, most of the time they're going to work their way through this content. The textbook is providing the content, and then they're going to work their way through some of these activities. Maybe not all of them. Maybe the teacher has some of their own as well. But the textbook provides some guidance. And this textbook has nothing about language. Yes, it teaches one vocabulary word, but it has nothing about the structures of the genre of history. So I'm going to show you another example now. I call this material B. Here we have material A. And I just want you to take a look at this example instead. Same text, I copy and pasted from the textbook, but I added some essential questions at the top. Notice essential question number 2 says, how do authors express cause and effect when writing about historical events? And then as you're looking at this, your eye probably already went to some things in purple. And you might be wondering, why are some things in purple? That is exactly what this material does for us. It makes the teacher and the students language alert by asking that question. Why are some things in purple? What's going on there? And it turns out those things in purple are going to help us answer essential question number 2, right? So we have these essential questions. We have these ideas in purple that are language-focused triggers that have now been put into our material. And then on the second side, in that lesson review portion, we have some comprehension questions. But we also have language-focused questions. What do you notice about those phrases in purple? What do they have in common? How do those purple phrases help you answer comprehension question number 2 there? And then we also have an application piece where students are asked to write a paragraph summarizing the information and use a specific language feature at least twice to express cause and effect. So in this material, that had much of the same content as that English textbook, we now have an integration of language right there on the worksheet that students are going to use. We have prompts for the teacher to talk about language. We have prompts for the students to think about language while they're thinking about content. In this case, focusing on cause and effect and focusing on one type of feature that's very common in historical text for showing cause and effect. So when we're thinking about redesigning our materials with this focus on language, there's a couple of things that I recommend that we keep in mind. The first, as I just said, is that we want to draw students and teachers' attention to language within the content. The beauty of these materials is that even a teacher who doesn't know that much about how to talk about content, language, they're very proficient in their language, but they don't know how to talk about it. These materials help them do so. And it also helps them know maybe what they need to study on the side, right? Before you teach this history unit, you're going to be talking about cause and effect. Maybe you need to go and look at how we form these structures, right? So drawing students and teachers' attention to language by doing things like typographic enhancements, language-focused information boxes, developing metalinguistic and functional knowledge about language. So different activities that have students sort different parts of language, dissecting sentences, analyzing language use, and then prompting students to produce language. And this, like I showed in my example, are specific language focused cues in the student prompts. So we're going to look at several more examples now. I want you to see some ideas of materials that teachers have actually used in their classrooms. And these ones are in Spanish, but I'll explain them hopefully enough to help those of you who don't speak Spanish understand what's going on. So I know it's small and I'm not actually expecting you to like read this paper in front of you, okay? So this is, I mentioned the teacher I worked with who had a Chilean textbook, and he taught world history. He also taught AP, world history. And so he was very happy to find this textbook that was a very high level. This was in a dual language Spanish program and in high school. So he was teaching 9th graders and he wanted to use this textbook. But the textbook was just content. There was nothing there about genres. There was nothing there about historical texts or historical arguments. And so he wanted to really have some help to focus on language in the textbook. And so what we did, and I'll talk at the end here a bit about some of the work that this entails. It's not, it's not nothing. Is we took some of the language out of the textbook and we redesigned this material. And so here we see the same content, the same text, but at this point, there's two little key things that were done to include a focus on language. One is we added a text, added a text box that has this genre explanation, so a prompt there. And then we numbered the sentences that they were then going to connect to a language-focused activity. So students read this just for content first. They just read this for content, but we included these numbered sentences because they were then going to do a language-focused activity after this. And what they were focusing on specifically was cause and effect again, that in this text was not shown through words like because, but was shown through relative clauses like that which or that. So the students they read this first for content, they talked about content, and then they took each of these numbered sentences and they broke them up into a sentence, sort of a sentence dissection table, if you will. And so for each number sentence, they broke it up to find the cause, the connecting words, and then the effect. And I've translated this one in English here. And so they were listing out all of these different sentences in order to start to focus on language. And they were noticing this same language pattern being used over and over in all of these different cause and effect sentences. So this was a separate material that we created, right? A new activity that the textbook didn't have, but that was connected to the textbook. We then also created another material. And again, I know this is small and I'm not expecting you to be able to read it. But this again was taken from the textbook, the same content that was in the textbook. It was about Athens democracy. And we put at the top a genre explanation. Okay, this is going to be a historical recount. Here's what to expect from language in this historical recount. The teacher I was working with wasn't terribly confident in being able to talk about a historical recount, but once the explanation was there on the material, he was able to lead that conversation and do so in a way that was productive. What we then did is we had a little bit of text with content for them to read and comprehend. And then we interspersed with comprehension questions, language analysis questions. I'm going to zoom in on this so that you can see it in more detail. So what was written here was essentially a question that was, what was the result of something that happened, right? We were focusing on cause and effect. What was the result of something that happened? And then what language clues in the text provided by the author helped you identify the effect? And it wasn't coincidence that we had a cause and effect question, a language question, a cause and effect question, and then a language question. So literally on the material, content and language were integrated. And this forced the students that as they thought about the content, they immediately thought like, geez, how do I know this? What language is helping me get there? And it also prompted the teacher to maintain that focus on language because his instinct was to really focus in on the content. That's how he'd been trained. He loved history and happened to teach in Spanish. And so by having the questions organized this way, as students were working in small groups, he was going around and reminding them to think about content and prompting them to think about content. And so what happened here is that as he was working with these materials, he expressed that he had a much better understanding of what content language integration could look like in the classroom. He used the prompts on the materials to remind and support him of his language instruction. And he said he wanted to use the materials again, which for me was the best, the best feedback of all. The materials were prompting him to integrate content and language. And what we found is that when materials prompt this focus on language, teachers are more likely to be language alert in their instruction, both proactively in the types of questions that they ask, and reactively in the type of corrective feedback that they provide. So those were some examples. I wanted you to see it yourself. And now I'm going to back up just a little bit and talk through some of the main components I suggest that you consider as you're working on materials. And before I do that, I do want to pause here for just one moment and say that I don't expect that teachers would go out and recreate their textbooks, right? That's way too much work. No teacher has time for that. However, if you are in a position where you're creating your materials anyways, I hope that you'll take these design principles and give them a try. Think, well, geez, I have to make this anyways. I'm pulling things from different places. Why don't I try to incorporate some language prompts on my content-focused materials? And maybe 1 unit a year or 1 week a year, you'll take some of the content. If you have a textbook, you'll try redesigning, 1 or 2 pages from your textbook that you're going to teach with a focus on language, as the teacher and I did here. So I'm going to pause for 1 second, grab a quick drink of water, and then we'll finish this off. So there's several design components, several layers of design components that I have found support this type of content and language integration. Notice that the language pieces are all happening within the context of content. So we're not teaching language decontextualized in a Grammar Friday or anything like that. So when you develop or redesign your own materials, I encourage you to think about both the content goals and a targeted language function or form, your language objective, if you're writing language objectives. And ask yourself, do the activities that are on this worksheet or this handout or the PowerPoint that I'm using, do they elicit or require that target language feature? Do the student prompts, do things that are talking to the students explicitly talk about language? Because our materials actually talk to our students, right? Is content and language integrated on the material? Is it content, language, or however you see fit? And when I use this material as a teacher, will I be reminded to also focus on language? Will it help me remember to have that language alertness? And so what are some ways that we can do this? First, having objectives or essential questions that relate to language written on the material itself. And the reason I suggest this is it really helps us just remember gosh, we got to focus on language too. We can't just worry about our content. This might look like things like this, asking what language does the author use to express their point of view in a seemingly neutral text. Hey, this is a science text. Okay, what language are they using to actually express a point of view here? Or an objective, I can use my knowledge of past tenses to understand an explanation of what happened. Putting that on the material or on your PowerPoint to remind you and the students, right? And then, as I showed in my examples, using typographic enhancements of language features, the goal here is to draw you and your students' attention to language. If it's built into the text, if you've used color already, you're less likely to forget to talk about it. I myself, and I've worked with so many teachers who are like, yeah, I've got my language objective. I'm going to talk about this. We're going to do a little, moment. And then you get into your content and you completely lose it. So something as simple as changing the color of certain language features can be incredibly helpful here. And it draws your students' attention to it. So they're going to start to be thinking and asking about language. I also encourage you to think about how you conclude language-focused tasks or questions. I showed some examples on mine. Excuse me. Another great example are margin questions. This comes from Pauline Gibbons. This one's a little bit much, I think. But you have a reading students are doing, and you're literally writing questions in the margin that prompt them to think about language as they are reading for content. Like I said, this I think is a bit much, this example of it. I would do many fewer questions to help with that cognitive load. But the idea is how literally on this reading that you've given students, is there something there that's going to prompt them to think about language? And then thinking about language-focused tasks. So if you're asking students comprehension questions about content, do you also have questions about language? Are you alternating the two if this works for you? So as my other example was, something like, what ultimately caused Nixon to resign? What language in the text helped you answer this question? Or list the effects of climate change based on the likelihood to occur. What words does the author use to indicate this likelihood? Maybe you want students to focus on modals like will, might, possibly, etc. So really linking content and language together. And then some type of language-focused application. However students are demonstrating or applying their understanding of the content, include an explicit prompt for language, whether it's write a summary paragraph, apply this to something new, try to have a prompt for language there. And the same language that you've been working on throughout, right? So we're almost done here. We're going to have some time for questions here at the end, but I want to include a sort of so what, now what, right? So what's the main point of all this? My main point for you, what I hope you take away from this, is that by incorporating language-focused components into content-based materials, this helps teachers remain language alert, and it helps them actively integrate language instruction within their content instruction. So the now what for you, if you're a teacher, when you're creating your new materials for your lessons, in 2 weeks from now, and you're trying to pull together your worksheet, consider use one of these strategies to just shift your attention to language a little bit. Maybe you're just going to use typographic enhancements. You're going to color in blue all of the pronouns that are going to be really important. And maybe that's all you have time to do, and that's just fine. But as you're building materials, I encourage you to think about which of these pieces you can add in to focus your and your students' attention to language. And so I want to end here before I answer questions. First with a thank you. Thank you so much for being here. You have my name and my email address here. I am happy to continue the conversation. Please feel free to reach out for me. I also want to share that the next steps of my work that I'm hoping that you'll be interested in engaging with me on is I am in the middle of completing a national survey here in the United States on what materials are used currently in secondary Spanish, dual language immersion, or bilingual education programs. So if you teach, or if you're an administrator, if you work in secondary Spanish programs, I would really, I'd be very grateful if you would take a few moments to complete this survey. I have a QR code here so that you can access it. There's a tiny URL that we can also add to the chat box. This is only for Spanish teachers right now. This is part of the CARLA initiative. We're completing a survey to get a better sense of what's being used out there in the country. We don't have a good database of materials that are out there for Spanish secondary programs, 6th grade through 12th grade programs. What I'm going to be doing with this work after this survey is completed is I'm going to be creating content and language integrated units for Spanish secondary, for science, social studies, and language arts that will eventually be available through CARLA's website. And we're hoping to make these units as applicable to the nation as possible. And thus the reason of doing this survey to begin with. So I hope that you'll take a few minutes to help me out by completing this survey if you work in a Spanish secondary program. And I'm going to pause here. I'll leave this up and I'm going to see what questions we have. All right, so someone asked what consideration should be made for how integrating content and language impacts lesson unit and program pacing. And that's a fantastic question. It slows things down, right? It slows things down within our lesson and within our unit. And so it is a question that we need to be reconciling with in dual language or bilingual programs of, is the goal, make sure I get this right, is the goal breadth or is the goal depth? Thinking about depth as depth of content, but also depth of language skills and language proficiency. But it is important to know that it does add time to a given lesson or a given unit when you're doing this type of work. I think it's time well spent, and that's what the teachers I work with have found as well, because their students then produce better outcomes in the end, and they understand the content better, right? If we're drawing their attention to cause and effect, then they better understand the content of what's causing what as they read that information. But it does slow things down, and that's certainly something that needs to be talked about at a programmatic level. It's also a reason, and this is somewhat a tangent, but that I encourage programs to make sure, especially at secondary, that you are not expecting that your world history 9th grade Spanish teacher is on the exact same curriculum as your world history 9th grade English monolingual teacher, because your Spanish dual language and immersion teacher is teaching content and language in a much more in-depth way than that monolingual teacher, although they should be doing it too, right? And so that's something to speak with admin about, that we need to unhinge or unlink our dual language strand programs from whatever their content colleagues might be doing in a mainstream classroom. Oops, done. Okay. What resources could or should be used to inform the language focus and their scope and sequence? Yes to all of the above that you wrote there, right? We can use the Common Core State Standards. If you work in Spanish, the Common Core State Standards have been translated into Spanish. Common Core State Standards in Espanol. It's out of California. I want to say San Diego. And so that's a great resource for those in Spanish in particular. The WIDA Spanish Language Development Standards as well can help us with some of that general scope and sequence. And then you also need to find the language within your content itself and within the products that you're asking students to complete. So I also, this gets beyond today's session, and is really something we talk about a lot in our summer institute. But having teachers in a secondary program working cross-disciplinarily so that they are hitting different genres and different products that they're having students complete, and then working backwards to plan across a program what language features are being targeted. But all of the resources that you would say there, I would say yes, they can all be used to inform that scope and sequence. Sam said, I love the examples you have shared. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how a teacher or materials designer can decide which language features to highlight. And I somewhat sort of was just answering that to some degree. There's many different ways that you can approach this. If your program has a scope and sequence, then you can build through that scope and sequence. You can look at a text and see, hey, what language feature is most prevalent in this text? That's what I'm then going to highlight and use. If there's a central text to your unit, or to your weekly lessons that you know is going to be very valuable. So that's one way. Another way is looking at the outcome of what you want students to produce and working your way backwards. And then you might have to modify your text a bit to make sure that language feature is there in the text itself. So there is not one approach to how you choose which language to teach. And it does require a somewhat heightened knowledge about language in order to make these decisions. And so I really encourage that secondary dual language immersion teachers work together, right, to do this work. So it's not just falling on one teacher, just deciding, okay, today I'm going to work on the past tense. So it is, right? It needs to be more intentional than that. Is any thought been given to how to plan language feature integration across a program or across the subjects in a year? Is there not a risk of ad hoc instruction? Yeah, and that's sort of what I was referring to, that I strongly encourage cross-disciplinary planning, not interdisciplinary, I mean, interdisciplinary also, but cross-disciplinary. Maybe you're not teaching the same unit, but maybe you're all working on the same genre, and you're going to target the language features that are unique to your discipline in that genre. So, hey, in October, we're all going to be thinking about inform as our genre. How do we inform in science? How is it different to inform in history? How is it different to inform in a language arts setting? And then targeting language features there. At the beginning of a program, if there's nothing like this, it will be ad hoc. I say ad hoc is better than nothing. But then over time, I would hope for a program to work together to create a programmatic plan that spirals language features, right? Repetition is not a bad thing when we're talking about language acquisition, but that is doing so intentionally. And that's some of my favorite work. I love working with districts to do some of that planning, but it takes time. It takes support from administrators. It is not something teachers should just be expected to do on their own in their classrooms, like all of their other planning, because it's really deep, intentional work that goes beyond just your daily lesson planning. We've got a few more minutes. I'm happy to hang out and see if there are any other questions. Thanks to those who are taking the survey right now. I so appreciate it. And as I said, please feel free to reach out to me after this presentation as well. I love talking with colleagues around the country, around the world. It's nice to expand beyond my little corner of northeastern Wisconsin here.
I'd also like to say thank you to Cory for spending her almost evening here with us. We purposely put this at the end of the day so some of the teachers who sometimes can't come to our lunchtime presentations could actually be with us. So we're happy to have you here. And we will follow this up with some links to the recording so you can share that with folks who weren't able to attend today. And the link to the Summer Institute, I put that in the chat, but we'll send that to you again. It's going to be online this year. We're going to do it sort of online one year and then in person another year so that people can choose which format that works best for them. And check out the website too. Also put a link in there for the initiative because we will continue to add resources to that page. So.
I will add too, real quickly, I saw Ayumi, thank you so much for offering to help disseminate the survey. If you are an admin here, if you work at the state level, even if you just have colleagues who couldn't make it tonight, please feel free to disseminate this survey around the country. We'd really like to have a good sense of what's being used all over our country to the best that we can.
Right, well, it seems like you answered the questions. I'm sure there are more, but people can reach out to you after they have a little time to think about it. But again, thank you so much, Cory, for sharing your time and talent with us. CARLA's very lucky to be able to work with you on this important issue.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.